Welcome, everybody. I'm glad that you all navigated the daylight savings, which seems to be giving people some hard time. Happy that you're here. My name is Mikey Mhanna. I am honored to introduce our special guest. Hoda Elsadda is the co-founder and chair of the Board of Trustees of the Women and Memory Forum. She's a professor of English and comparative literature at Cairo University, a feminist and an activist for women's rights. She previously held a chair in the study of contemporary Arab world at Manchester University and was a co-director of the Center for Advanced Study of the Arab World in the UK. She was a Carnegie Visiting Scholar at Georgetown University in 2014 and a visiting scholar at the Asfari Institute at the American University of Beirut in 2017. In 1992, she co-founded and edited Hajar, an interdisciplinary journal in women's studies published in Arabic. She was a member of the 50-person committee that drafted the Egyptian constitution endorsed in a referendum in 2014, and was a coordinator of the Freedoms Rights Committee in the Constitutional Assembly. In 1997, she co-founded and is currently chairperson of the Board of Trustees in the Women and Memory Forum, a research organization which focuses on rereading Arab culture history, from a gender-sensitive perspective. She's a member of the editorial board of the Journal of Middle East Women's Studies, JMEWS, a member of the advisory board of the Durham Modern Language Series, associate editor of the online edition of the Encyclopedia of Women and Muslims Cultures, member of the board of directors of the Global Fund for Women, a member of the advisory board of Raida, member of the Arab Families Working Group, and a member of the Board of Trustees for the Sawiris Cultural Award. Hoda, welcome to Afikra. Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for having me.
It is a pleasure to have you on. I was telling you before the event that I am so intimidated and enamored by the amount of really valuable work that you're doing. So I'm really honored that you're on the series.
Thank you for saying that. I mean, that's very kind of you. Thank you.
So as I just read in your bio, your work focuses on gender studies, women, memory. These words keep on coming up, which is, for those of us who didn't study gender studies, are not working in that space. There's a term that I've heard you talk about and I've read in your work that is not a term that I think a lot of people are aware of. And because your work seems to be consumed with the role of women in society and in a nation and in the government, and sort of how we sort of should be thinking about that, can you help me understand what this term state feminism is in its many forms?
Yes, I'll try.
Yeah, please.
So, yeah, I mean, I'll begin by saying that state feminism as a term, as a phrase, has many different implications in different contexts. So if you think of Sweden, Norway, northern countries north of, particularly in Europe, it's actually a positive, it carries positive connotations. It simply denotes the efforts by states to advocate for women's rights and to be actively involved in issuing laws that protect women. So state feminism can be a good thing. In the Arab world, it's a contested term. Why? Because it's often about manipulation and co-optation by states, by undemocratic states, of the women, of social movements. So it has this implication of intervention, control, nationalizing civil society, perhaps, controlling and monopolizing, speaking on behalf of women, pushing aside, excluding women rights activists who are independent. So it's a term that has different connotations in different contexts. Yeah.
Is it also a term that has changed over time in the Arab world? So if we were having a conversation 50 years ago, would it change both sort of longitudinally as well as geographically? If we're having a conversation in Morocco versus a conversation in Sudan versus a conversation in Saudi, can you sort of give a little context about the the dynamic nature of this term, time-wise as well as geographically?
Yes, thank you. I mean, this is a very good point. Thank you for making that. Yes, so there are important differences between Arab countries and between different historical periods. And so, I mean, Tunis is a good example. So in Tunis, for example, there's been a very active state feminism, perhaps still contested, you know, because I can't just say, have a blanket statement where state feminism in a particular country was, you know, functioned better than other countries. But I would say that there have been, if you think of Egypt, for example, there have been different moments of state feminism. So I would say that in the 60s and the 60s, there was an overpowering state feminism where it was the state who absolutely controlled speaking on behalf of women, and the 70s perhaps. 80s and 90s, we see the beginnings and the emergence of independent women's groups who competed with state feminism, or who at least contested discourses by state feminism, and they managed to have independent knowledge production, advocating for particular issues that were not necessarily advocated for by the state. So there are different periods. And then, of course, you have the phenomenon of national councils of women, which is a phenomenon of the 21st century. And again, the functioning of these national councils, or entities that advocate for women in specific contexts, again, have different functions. But definitely, we can argue that independent feminist groups manage to collaborate and cooperate with state feminists in Morocco to produce a very, it's not a perfect, but a good step and a good family law, if you like. I mean, a better version of family law that compared to the one that was in existence. So yes, there have been moments when there is cooperation between feminists and state feminists, independent feminists and state feminists. There have been moments when people have shifted ground. So, feminists can actually, if you like, take on or accept positions in the state and use their positions to advocate for women. It's a very nuanced story. It's not black and white. And yes, definitely many women have managed to interact with states and to have positions and use these positions to advocate for women. So it's not a black and white story, but it's a contested term, especially in the third world in undemocratic contexts.
So you're calling us from Cairo right now. I'd love to sort of go back to some of your formative years to understand when you first became interested in this work and why. Is there a story that sort of jumps to mind that helped tie you in and sort of rope you into studying this early on?
It's a good question. There's always, I'm always asked the question in a much more perhaps forward, aggressive way. Let me just say, this is not what you're doing. But somehow there's this assumption that for to be a feminist, you have to have like this really intense experience of discrimination. Reality.
Well, I mean, even if you're going to become a cardiologist.
No, absolutely. No. I mean, it's a good question, and it's important. I always say that I had a very privileged upbringing. I come from a very liberal family. I did not suffer from any discrimination, in the family, which is wonderful. And even when as an academic, and this is a story I like to tell, really. I mean, I joined the Department of English, and the Department of English, there's, if you look at Cairo University, it's an interesting, there's an interesting observation about how, because of my times, there was this socialist regime, and the way you're appointed as an academic and you get a position at university, it was just on the grounds of your exam results, really. So, I mean, if you're first, you're appointed. If you're second, you're not. So regardless of gender, which leads to the situation where my department, the Department of English, which is, I'm very proud to belong to, consisted of really strong women academics. I, again, as the beginning of my career, there was no discrimination against me. I didn't really have to fight or to try and jump hurdles to become professor. That's the reality. So having said that, I think I came to feminism through my reading of literary texts. Again, I owe this to my department and the fact that I read a lot of literature by men and women. I always mention, I remember reading Edward Said, really, I mean, like 1979, a year after his book was published. And it struck me how this idea of the feminization of the weak, the colonized, the weak link in any relationship, and how, I mean, this really struck a chord, you know, how all of the, if you like, derogatory terms that are, you know, related to women were actually used against the colonized, us Arabs, for example, in this colonial relationship.
Can you give an example of this for those?
Yes, I mean,
yeah.
Edward Said talked about how the man, the colonized man, was feminized. So the white colonizer was rational, but of course the colonized Arab was emotional. I mean, this is exactly how a binary opposition is constructed between men and women. So, you know, men are rational, women are emotional. So they can't make good judgments about their lives, and therefore they need the men's, you know, guidance and supervision and so on. The exact same logic was used to justify colonialism. The exact same logic was used to justify colonization. For me, this was really eye-opening, and it made me reconsider, you know, stereotypes about women, myself. But also, I think that and again, my experience told me that I was perfectly rational and emotional, nothing wrong with emotional, but perfectly rational. And I didn't, so I could immediately log into this, this comparison. And that was very, I think that really influenced my thinking. I read, you know, women writers, Latifa Zayed, Layla Bal. I mean, you know, there are many, many great women writers who wrote about the relationship to the world, questioned patriarchal societies. These were all very powerful, I think, influences on my life and my career.
So I want to talk about, I was mentioning this to you before the call. I'm always interested in sort of activist movements, social justice movements, whose sort of, you know, social justice, you know, you're chasing a horizon in many ways, every single movement. And so the latest generation of activists can reflect on their predecessors in many different ways. They can reflect on them as saying, we're standing on your shoulders and you pushed the ball up so far and now we're taking it from here, and we understand we were chasing a different horizon, although maybe your goals were you know, not as long as sort of long-term as our goals. Sometimes they're critical of predecessors and critical of short-sightedness or something that they think was actually detrimental. I'm curious about how you as an activist reflect on some of your predecessors in Egypt. There's a long history of Egyptian feminists and activists and writers. You know, we were talking briefly about this this magazine, you know, Al-Fatat, that was, you know, published in 1892, you know, 130 years ago, that was primarily concerned with women's society. So what is your sort of relationship with some of the writing from activists coming from Egypt over the last 130 years?
Yeah. I mean, thank you for the question, really, because it's, as you say, there are different, different people have different approaches to this question. But for me, I see the link with previous generations, this generational, relationship is really a question of continuity and accumulative knowledge and building on each other. I mean, and learning from previous experiences, but obviously trying to do something different. Otherwise, we'd be doing the same thing forever, which is not, which is not normal. So absolutely, I see that we have to, we build on what on previous generations' knowledge production, achievements, but we also differ from them, and we have the right to be critical of perhaps some of the things they did, which, I mean, respectfully critical. There's no problem in that, because obviously we need to learn from mistakes, and I'm sure we're doing mistakes. We're making mistakes as well, and I expect, you know, the younger generation are also, I hope, learning from these mistakes and also looking at them critically. The Fatah is I'm very happy that we managed to republish this particular journal. It's the first women's journal in the Arab world to be published end of the 19th century. And I just need to signal here that at Women in Memory, we're very concerned and interested in the preservation of our tradition. And one of the motives for actually republishing it is that we were not able to find a single copy of this magazine in libraries in Egypt. They were either, I don't know what happened to them, but they were not available. And I photocopied this journal from I have to say, the library of Yale, the Yale Library. And I say that in the introduction because we need a concerted effort to preserve our tradition, to preserve our history, and to make sure that we are able to tell the story to future generations.
This is a perfect time to talk about Women in Memory, and which is an organization that you helped co-found in 1995. I'm curious about, before we get into the work, I'm curious about the name. It's a very intentional name. Why that name?
Yes, Al-Mar'a wal-Zakara, Women in Memory. I think it's about, we wanted to foreground the whole issue of memory. What is it that we remember, how we remember, and the fact that we according to us, the group, the Women in Memory group, we felt that women have been marginalized in mainstream historical narratives. They've been excluded. Their stories have not been told properly. And this has resulted in a disconnect, first of all, between society and its history, between women and their history. And we felt that revival of memory in general, but women, the memory of women in particular, would allow us to rethink our history and fill in gaps, but also raise important theoretical questions about knowledge, about what counts as knowledge, whose knowledge counts, who decides on what counts and what is worthy of being preserved and written. So Women in Memory, we've tried to address these questions doing different things. It started out, I mean, we have what we call a revival project, revival of women's memory. We're focusing here on Egyptian history. So for example, we started digging and looking for forgotten texts. So we republished, for example, Nisa'iyat, which is a collection of essays by Malak Hifni Nasif, a really important pioneer of feminism, an important contributor to the ideas at the beginning of the century. She was a columnist. She was extremely well known. She died at an early age, but then somehow was forgotten. You know, she was dropped from history, so very few people knew about her. So we republished her work. We held a conference. We invited researchers to think about her relationship to society, to her contribution to the Nahda period, and so on. And I think, and we've done that with a number of women. And I think that, so this was one of our aims, to revive women's history, bring them back to, to our, tell future generations about them and so on. And we try and do that on many different levels. So actually the previous slide had this, it just happens to be about an exhibition we held a couple of years ago, Doing Well, Don't Worry, which is something that I particularly like. It's a traveling exhibition that was, again, organized by Women in Memory in cooperation with other partners, American University in Egypt and the Women's Museum in Denmark. And it's about women in the Arab world, their stories and their objects. And it's about mobility, it's about identity. But let me just comment on the title because I like it. Doing Well, Don't Worry happens to be the title of a letter that was written in prison, in women's prison. So it was written on pink toilet paper and sent by a woman prisoner, Shahinda Makhlet. She was imprisoned by Sadat, and she sent it to the daughter of a friend of hers. And she's trying to basically tell her family and friends not to worry, she's fine, even though she's in prison. So she describes, her prison cell as if she's describing a five-star hotel, which was not a five-star hotel, of course. I mean, we know that. And then, in the middle, it's really an interesting letter. It's a combination. It's sad, but it's also funny, and ends with this brilliant phrase, doing well, don't worry. أنا بخير اطمن. So anyway, so we had this. So this was like, again, a reminder of women's history, a reminder of women's agency. Shahinda Makhlet is a figure, of course, in Egyptian history, very active for farmers' rights and so on. I can go on about this forever.
It gives me less of an excuse to tweet how all of my emotions and why I'm not doing well on my $1,000 iPhone.
Well, exactly. Something to think about. Absolutely.
Something to think about, indeed. Okay, so I love thinking about memory. We had Tara Aris on the series a few days ago, and we were sort of exploring the relationship between memory and imagination. And so part of the mission statement of Women in Memory, which I have on the screen for those of you who are listening to the podcast later, part of the mission is, through this mission, it's Women in Memory Forum or Foundation, aims to contribute effectively to the production and dissemination of alternative knowledge about women in the Arab region. It also aims to reread Arab tradition and cultural history in order to create a new cultural and social awareness. So it's almost as if there is this relationship between the way we remember women in the region and the way we imagine women going forward. And I'm wondering if there are some examples of that, where there has been a rereading and a reimagination.
Absolutely. I think a good example would be the way tradition, for example, or at least representations, very, very selective representations of our tradition, or just to be focused, our Islamic tradition, as the way it's used to argue that women, have very specific roles to play, and that somehow, they're, entering society, taking on, participating in professions, becoming doctors and engineers and teachers and so on. It's a feature of the modern period, and somehow an influence of the West on the Arab world. And of course, one of the things that my colleagues, I have two colleagues at Women in Memory, Umayma Abu Bakr and Hoda Elsadda, whose work is focused on rereading the early Islamic period and the position of women. And they have published, and they have managed to, they have gone on this, I call it excavation project, in old manuscripts, in old biographical texts, looking for mentions of women, very, very brief mentions. And then from these, and collecting these brief mentions, they make a story, and they're able to create a story about this, about particular women, know more about them. And they've published about women who were medical doctors, who practiced medicine, women who were faqihat in the early Islamic period, teachers, of course, architects. So basically deconstructing this idea that somehow, women in the public sphere is a feature of the modern period, the 20th century, and an effect of colonial intervention. It is not true. So, this particular project, going through early Islamic period, but, going and wading through the manuscripts and many, many texts that don't really mention women directly, but then creating these stories, I think is important in rethinking our history and our relationship to our history, but also our visions of the future and our ideas about identities, for example. What does it mean what does it mean to have, what is the Arab identity anyway? What is the Egyptian identity? What is the Lebanese identity? How is that a construct? And how is this related to the past? And what does it mean for the future?
Yeah.
Yes.
Hoda, if you'll allow me, I'm really curious about something. Mm-hmm. You've been in this space thinking about these issues for a few decades at this point. I'm really curious, like if you were speaking to 1995 Hoda and giving her advice on the work that she's doing, both as a scholar as well as an activist, what are some of the lessons learned that you would offer to that 1995 version of yourself? Both in terms of the way your thinking has evolved, but also maybe giving this person clues on how to navigate some of the challenges.
I mean, okay. I mean, I love your questions, Mike, I have to say. So I like it because, you know what, I would say, follow your dreams. When the idea of women in memory, in the early 1990s, we had a lot of ambition. I had this sort of, vision for the future. I wanted to do this. I was hoping that we'll be able to, the idea of women in memory when we started seemed to be so difficult. And obviously, as some people encouraged us, but on the whole, we were not terribly encouraged by everybody. But looking back, we managed. I have to say, I'm very proud of women in memory. So, I can't be, I'm going to be to pretend, any kind of false modesty here, but to say that I am really proud of women in memory as an idea, as a contribution to the feminist scene, as a model, I think, for how we can practice feminism and interact with activists, with academic circles, with state institutions. We've managed to survive quite a few hurdles. So I think, yes, definitely, ideas always start with a dream that looks really difficult to get hold of, but dreams do come true. I think that's really
yeah. Were there any specific challenges that you think, even I guess scholastically, how has your own understanding of this work evolved over time? On what subjects would that 1995 version of you disagree with the 2021 version of you?
Yeah, there were many, many obstacles. From an academic point of view, the Women in Memory group was not an ideological group, if you like. We were feminists, but some of us were, if you think, I don't know how, it's difficult to categorize, but let me just say that some of us wanted to work on the modern period, but we also wanted to explore Islamic history, and we wanted to be able to see the connections. We did not decide that this is, a purely secular group that has nothing to do with Islamic traditions and so on. But we tried to bring in many, many branches together. And we had some disagreements. Not disagreements in the terms of, disagreements that we can't figure out, but we had different approaches to how to do this. But we agreed on general principles, feminist principles, working towards justice, exploring discourses, questioning the taken for granted, and always trying to be very reflective and so on. So, I think at the beginning, we tried to, bring to the scene a model that was not quite there, let me just say. Groups were either leftist or this or that. There were sort of ideological definitions that were very powerful at the time. And of course, I need to mention that feminism has had a very bad name in the Arab world. So when you identify yourself as a feminist, you have to get into this self-defense mode immediately, of explaining and justifying. And so yes, at the beginning, we had to do a lot of justifying, a lot of explaining, a lot of, oh no, we're not man-haters, wallahi, and, we do want, we are seeking rights for everybody, we're not exclusionary. Feminism is not against national independence. Feminism is not against democracy. It's not, it's not a subversion of anything democratic. It's about men and women. I mean, these are all, of course, these are all, challenges that we had to accept. I think now, some of these challenges exist, and I will always get the question. I think already someone has already posed a question about feminism as a Western concept. That's always there. And my response to this challenge is to say, really, it's so unfair to the history of women in the Arab world. So unfair, because while maybe some concepts like gender, for example, have been coined in the West, absolutely. But concepts are a reflection of realities on the ground and a way of naming issues that have already been expressed. But then you find a good title or name or label to facilitate communication. But if you think of, I remember I was asked a question, why are you working on gender in Egypt? It's completely foreign and Western. And my response was, what does that mean? Gender is about, it's focusing on power relations, looking at how social relations that are based on a perceived difference between the sexes, and that how these perceived differences are actually a function of unequal power relations. And these are issues that were discussed by feminists from the 19th century in Egypt. So I will just give you an example. Malak Hafni Nassif, obviously, who I'm very fond of, once wrote, challenging male reformers, basically, and telling them, why have you decided that women are made to stay at home while men are made to go and provide, for the family? Who said that? God didn't say that. And then she says, had I been allowed to board the ship with Christopher Columbus, I too would have discovered America. And that's a really interesting statement. It's an acknowledgement of, why women are excluded. It's an acknowledgement of patriarchal, dominance. It's so. If this is not gender awareness, what is?
Yeah. Do you think, just thinking about I'm always interested in speaking to educators because I'm interested in the people they're educating. And if you think about the sort of generations of students that you've had over the years, has there been a tick in one direction or another, or has it fluctuated? Has it oscillated? Like if you took a classroom in 1997 versus 2007 versus 2017, the first principles questions that you hear from a random 18-year-old, 19-year-old, 20-year-old in your class, have they changed over time? Are they asking the same exact questions, or has there been an evolution or devolution or revolution in their questions?
I'm not sure how to, I'm trying to think here. Things have changed. I think, I like to think of 2011 as a turning point in our history, in the history of the Arab region. And it's a turning point for on many levels. It's not just for, for feminism. Yeah. But it's a turning point because this was, there was a revolutionary moment, and revolutions raise existential questions, but they also allow people to really ask difficult questions and break taboos. And I think many taboos have been broken in 2011, just because there were, for a while, obviously, things have changed, but, for a certain period of time, there was a space, the political spaces were opened, and people were able to discuss issues seriously, as opposed to, just, fencing with each other, ideological fencing that doesn't really take you anywhere. But, some issues were discussed seriously. One of those issues, I think, had to do with gender. And for example, sexual violence against women. You know, before 2011, this was really a huge taboo. You don't talk about sexual violence against women, you talk about other forms of violence. Post 2011, the taboo was broken. So I think in many ways, yes, this generation definitely post 2011, where the media was opened up for a while. Now they have access to social media, and really social media, I think, has an impact on young generations in ways that we haven't seen. I mean, obviously my generation, you had to know the person to be able to know something, but now it's different.
I mean, just looking at this magazine, understanding that this type of knowledge production was so meaningful in 1892, to understand that on TikTok and on Twitter and on Instagram and on Facebook and on, on every one of these platforms, there is this enormous amount of type of media production that is being shared cross-border, cross everything. Yeah, definitely. That's a huge transformational tool.
Absolutely.
What we're being transformed into, I'm not sure, but it's definitely, there's transformation.
True. Scary sometimes, but transformation for sure.
So speaking of post 2011, this is a part of your bio, and I was joking with you beforehand, but I'll make the same joke. You know, whenever I read somebody's bio and I see the same bio pasted all over the place, and there's the same sentence. She was a member of the 50-person committee that drafted the Egyptian constitution and endorsed in a referendum in 2014. I'm always curious, what does that sentence actually mean? So take me back to 2013, 2014, when you were part of this committee. How were you selected? What was your role? Do you wince every time somebody reads that? Or are you proud of it? Is it a good memory? Is it a complicated memory? Tell us a little bit about that.
It's good, complicated, contested. It's everything. It's everything. But if I just think about it from a 2013 perspective, I mean, now of course many things have happened, but from a 2013 perspective, this was really, okay, maybe let me just sort of step back very quickly and say that until 2011, I was professor at Manchester University, at the University of Manchester. I resigned and I came back when so this, just to let you know how involved I was in what was happening.
That's the level of your investment. It's big.
Yes,
investment.
So I mean, I was really invested. I mean, I actually resigned and I went back to Egypt, and I became very involved in all sorts of things. I joined a political party. I mean, for me, this was like a huge experience, but I felt at the time that this was the moment to basically put your money where your mouth is and do something. And so I joined the party. I was vice president of the party for a couple of years. So I really, just sort of jumped into the whole thing. Just to explain the context. So I was extremely involved politically. And the constitution, when this happened, so my selection, this was a surprise, but I mean, not a huge surprise, because I was selected as a public figure who was very involved in women's rights issues. So, and if you look at the constitution, the committee, the members, this was a moment in our history when it was possible to have such a committee, where you actually had human rights activists, state people, representatives of the many different parties that were on the ground. It was an interesting group of people, let me just say. I mean, it's not a long story to talk about, but interesting, definitely, and very, very, some members were extremely respected by everybody. And it was a moment of a lot of, so we were having meetings and there was fighting on the streets, people shooting at each other. So it was a very, very intense moment when we had to do this. But it was also this moment when, 2013, huge transformations in the political system, a moment of a lot of fear, but also a lot of hope. A lot of people actually looked at this constitution, waited for salvation. Somehow this constitution was going to save the day. I mean, I'm not suggesting that this is what we did necessarily, but, there were a lot of hope and so on. So it was a huge responsibility. I was terrifying, but also really important. And I think back and I feel I'm content that I did my best. I was head of the Committee for Freedoms and Rights. And I think this particular chapter in the Constitution has been acknowledged as really one of the best chapters in the Constitution. We were able to insert very important clauses, articles, and so on. It was a moment when we were able to work with different parties. We were able to host meetings, consultations with civil society actors, with human rights actors. It was really a very intense and powerful moment. Unprecedented, didn't happen after. I mean, it was really one of those really important moments. So what does it mean? It means that I really gave it everything that I had. And I'm satisfied with many of the things that happened. I'm not 100% satisfied with the final outcome, of course. So it's been an experience that I look back on, and I think I did my best, and I did my responsibility. I was responsible, and I.
In 70 years, when future activists are sort of criticizing the law and the Constitution, in theory, they'll be criticizing that chapter, right? Because we're chasing a horizon. But you welcome that criticism. You say, of course, it needs to be improved.
Oh, I mean, I agree with them. They're not criticizing the chapter, but they're criticizing the lack of abidance by the chapter. I mean, I have to say that. So okay. Yeah. So what I say is that I think what I don't know how to say that, but what I can say is that, the consequences and what comes after is really out of my control. I have no control over what happened. But as far as the chapter is concerned, I think there's no criticism of the articles in the chapter. The criticism is really about not the lack of abidance. So yeah, I mean, that's
So if you were sort of giving advice to activists and sort of folks who care about social justice and care about causes, whether the causes they care about are environmental, whether they're related to sexuality, whether they're related to animal rights, regardless of what they're related to, you would sort of advocate, and correct me if I'm wrong, for sort of a pragmatic, incrementalist approach working with current state functions and current state actors, or you wouldn't? Or dependent on the situation?
Depends on the context. My response will always be it's contextual. So there are moments when, yes, you can actually work with state bodies and institutions, and it's important to do that. And again, if you look at history, it's not just one story, but there are different stories. But there are moments when you can't, and that's fair enough. And then this is when you really need to be very focused on independence and working from outside the system, and that's fair. So I would, incremental, definitely. But who you work with, decisions on your partnerships, your alliances, and so on is really it's determined by context. It's difficult to have a general.
Okay. Hoda, I think we're going to have to postpone a broader conversation about all of this amazing work that you've done, unless there's questions in the chat. As I mentioned from the very beginning, you've done an enormous amount of work, and so it's impossible to cover everything in only 1 hour. So maybe you'll humor us in the future and come back on the series to talk more specifically about some of these publications in the books. But let's jump to the quick Q&A and ask you these 4 quick questions, and then we'll open it up to the chat for questions from the audience. Okay, right now, what are you reading or watching right now?
Okay, right now, so 2 books that were published this year. I love historical novels. I love autobiographical stories. So I've just finished reading actually a novel slash autobiography called Yaqub, and it's written by one of my colleagues at Cairo University. He's a professor of history, Mohamed Afifi, and it's a story of Yaqub, who's this very controversial figure in our history because he's been called a traitor because he was seen to have cooperated with the French invasion of Egypt. So the French campaign, he was one of. So, but then Afifi, the story is about the student, the history student, Mohamed Afifi basically, and his being haunted by this figure and following his story and trying to construct a more nuanced story of this figure that's not black and white, that's not either a traitor or a nationalist, which is how history is usually written. So I find that very interesting. It's a very short novel, but very, very interesting. I've also read, let me just mention very quickly, I've also just finished reading an autobiography by Azza Fahmi, who's really this very famous designer of jewelry. But it's really good. It's a fantastic read because it's about her, her beginnings and her apprenticeship in Khan al-Khalili, a world dominated by men, how she learned the trade, how she became really this top designer of a particular craft, how she preserves the craft. So these are the two things I've just...
Okay, I love them. Okay, who would you love to shadow for a day, past or present?
Yes, okay. So okay, you have to realize that I'm somebody who just loves stories, right? So, and I've done a lot of interviews and I've met and I've had the privilege to meet really interesting people. So to pick, I think I'll say Marie Assad. Marie Assad is this, pioneering feminist. She died a couple of years ago. She's a trailblazer, if you can say, definitely a trailblazer. She joined the World Council of Churches when she was very young and worked on feminist theology, introduced feminism to the World Council of Churches, in the 50s and the 60s, at a time when no one was talking about feminism. She's an environmentalist. She helped create this important organization that works with the Zabbalin. So she works on environment. She led a task force to combat FGM, female genital mutilation in Egypt. And more importantly, she was a fantastic mentor. She was this wonderful, wonderful woman who supported, gave guidance, was so modest, provided space for a lot of us to, meet and so on. So she was just a fantastic person. I'm happy to pay tribute to her.
Amazing. So after the chat, you're going to have to type these names into the chats for people to look into. Sure. All right, let's do this last one. What do people most misunderstand about your work? And then I'm going to open it up to the questions in the audience.
I think it's really about what is most understood about feminism. And I think I've touched upon this a little bit. It's Western concept. It's Westernized. It tells, if you talk about feminism, it's about imperial intervention in affairs of our states and so on. So I think this is again, feminists as man haters, feminists dividing, breaking ranks with, if you like, the national front and so on. I think that's that's the challenge to feminists in the Arab world. I mean, mind you, many women hesitate to call themselves feminists just to avoid this kind of criticism. So I think that's it, yeah.
Okay, so what I'll do is I'm going to read one of Samira's questions. Where do you see your work going next? What are the goals for the Women and Memory Forum in the future?
Thank you. We've had, we're going through a transitional phase. We've done that before. There have been, we started 95, so there have been phases. I think our next phase is how to become a feminist cultural hub. How to use our, our history and so on in providing a space for feminist discussions, hosting different generations between different generations. I would like to continue some of our, I think we will continue some of our signature projects, which is the Oral History Archive. We do a lot of, education workshops, introducing feminist concepts and theories to university students, but also to NGO workers, in civil society. So we have a couple of what we call signature projects that we would like to continue. Definitely, we want to expand our library. We started this. We have a library which is not bad. It's decent, but I would love to have a better library of feminist, not feminist, everything that's been written about women and gender in the Arab world, because it does not exist anywhere. It's difficult to find sources. I mean, if you're working on these topics and you want to consult Arabic sources, they're just scattered everywhere. But we try to have this, to have a library that actually offers researchers this opportunity to come and consult, and it's already there, but I want to improve it. And I would like us to be, I think of Women in Memory as an integral part of the Arab women's movement, joining forces with other activists in the Arab world in advocating for very specific issues. That's, yeah, I think that's
okay. UC, you're up next. If you can unmute. If not, I'll read it for you. Okay, let me read it for her. Thanks for all your amazing work. You're so inspiring. My question is, what can American women learn from Egyptian feminists?
Feminists all over the world have been learning from each other, for a very long time, because it's not. It's difficult to say what can American women learn from Egyptian women, or what can Egyptian women learn from American women. I would just say that in the last, definitely 20, 30 years, we talk about transnational feminism, and we talk about exchanges between feminists, and this has been happening for a very long time. So already there have been exchanges and learning lessons, and I think it's always good to compare and contrast. I think between experiences, because it's not true that what's happening to us in Egypt is only happening to us, because it can be happening to women in America and so on and so forth. So I can't really single out a particular issue, but I just say that these exchanges have been happening for a very long time.
Okay, 3 quick questions. We'll do them as fast as possible. So from Noha, she says, you're incredibly fascinating. You're extremely smart. When will you be running for president?
Okay. So I thought about it. Of course, I haven't. Come on. Thank you for saying that. I'm completely outside politics. I focus on my work and my research and my engagement with young scholars. Okay.
Eliza says, as both a professor of literature and a feminist activist, what are your general thoughts on Naguib Mahfouz's depictions of female characters in his books?
Well, thank you for the question. I don't know how to answer quickly, but I'll try, because in my book, Gender Nation, the Arabic novel, I actually have a chapter on Mahfouz and his trilogy. And if you look at, very quickly, if you look at Amina, Mahfouz is really, Mahfouz's trilogy is fantastic in understanding this particular period and how representations of ideal femininity and ideal masculinity worked. And Amina is this icon of the traditional woman, who was the binary opposite of the new woman that was advocated for by other writers. And she's traditional, lovable, but superstitious. She's treated with kind condescension by her children. So while lovable, but was not presented, does not really present us with a model that anybody wants to follow, really. It's actually, her story becomes obsolete. She's like a figure of the woman who's going to be obsolete in the national imaginary. But then this is just one example.
Yeah. Okay, we are over time, so I want to respect your time. Hoda, thank you so much for really generously sharing your time and perspective with us. I've learned a ton from you, and I expect to continually learn even more as I dive into your work. It's been a pleasure to have you on the series.
Thank you, Mikey. Pleasure being with you in this conversation, and thank you for all the questions, and thank you everybody for your questions.
Okay, everybody, this talk will show up on YouTube and on our podcast. If you have friends in your life who you think would be interested, please share the link after it comes out, spread the word, and hopefully we'll have more of you at events coming soon. We have events every day this week. We have an event, so please tune in and see you next time. Bye, everybody.